You're listening to the Family Health Lab. Healthy parents, healthy kids.
Hi, Ali. Welcome to my podcast. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, Claire. Thanks for inviting me on. My pleasure.
I'm really looking forward to getting into this chat. We've met in the past at Real Food Rocks, I think it was, and we've had a couple of chats going back. So yeah, I'm really interested in what you're working on now and how everything has evolved for you. Quite a lot in this space. But first of all, I saw something you posted a few months ago, and it was about a controversy that was going on in the UK. It was about Joe Wicks, and he'd made some comments about ADHD. And I know ADHD is a topic close to your heart, so you made a video on that. So why did you do that, and what was the controversy?
Yeah, so the controversy was that Joe Wicks had said that food may be causing children's ADHD symptoms, and he quickly backtracked when he got piled on and said that he didn't know what he was talking about. But I defended him in the video because I think that, when we look at any psychiatric symptoms that are quite prevalent at population level, the sort of 1 to 3% range. So you're talking ADHD, schizophrenia, depression, that kind of thing. It makes me wonder through an evolutionary lens, what are the chances that we've evolved over tens of thousands of generations as humans or hominids in close to our modern form? And to have these disease states at population level, I think the chances are very, very slim. And that means that it's not a genetic destiny, that it's an interaction of genes and environment, but that also genes that can predispose to these conditions will give us something good. That's why they're there. They were selected for under evolutionary pressure, where they conferred some benefit to the people who were our ancestors who survived these evolutionary pressures. So I believe that things like ADHD, schizophrenia, depression, the genes that predispose to that will confer some benefit. But when there's an environmental assault in the modern world, that can lead to this pathological disease state where you get these symptoms. And so I defended Joe Wicks saying that food can cause ADHD because what I found in my own history is I got an ADHD diagnosis from a psychiatrist in the UK in 2015 on the NHS. And then in 2016, when I was kind of sick and tired of the Ritalin not working properly anymore and the side effects, I tried a ketogenic diet mainly for weight loss. And within a couple of weeks, I could feel, my cognition being so much better, my mood being so much better, the anxiety and the seasonal depression that I had, didn't come back. So I think food can cause symptoms of psychiatric disorders. And I think removing foods that can cause problems and adding foods that can prevent them can keep them away. So that's what the video was about. And so 8 years on, I've kind of done a few things around this area. We met at Real Food Rocks in 2018 when I was doing food, and I've done a cookbook on this. I've done various food products to help people do what I did because I felt, morally compelled to do it. I used to be a physicist and I thought I've got to change career here. And because the mental health part was so important to me, I really was on the lookout for being able to do something about that. And I made that that ADHD video defending Joe Wicks in Oxford, where I'm just about to start a research project using ketogenic diet for ADHD with depression. So basically, try to formally, academically pin down to what extent what I did can help other people.
That's fascinating, and I can't wait to hear more about that. and how you're progressing, and let people know as well about how they can follow. But just diving back, why do you think people reacted so strongly to what Joe Wick said in terms of food causing ADHD? Because, I mean, what you're saying to me seems extremely sensible, and quite measured, really, not controversial, but yet it's seemingly very controversial to say that food has an impact, which is what you're saying. It's very different to saying food causes ADHD. Now, I'm echoing what you're saying, because there's something very iffy about the rapid rise of prevalence. We have now 1 in 9 were diagnosed with ADHD, whereas it was 1 in 24. So we've had a tripling over one generation. Now, I'm told repeatedly, because I do work in schools on food programs, and also work with a number of families changing their diet around adults and teens with ADHD. And I hear again and again and again from specialists that this is genetic, and and it improves screening and diagnostics, which is absolutely true. And they are very heritable, gene-based conditions. But it's how we're interacting with our world, and that food piece that's so important, which is exactly what you've experienced very personally with your own ADHD. Why do you think there's anger out there, and that there was a lot of pushback for Joe Wicks's comments on food could play a role in ADHD?
Yeah, I think it's a complicated set of reasons, and it'll differ from person to person why it affects them. I made a joke in a previous video about whether the progress of humans would have advanced much more rapidly if cavemen had been taking Ritalin. Do we have an innate Ritalin deficiency? Is that what's going on? And actually, instead of the cave paintings at Lascaux, that look like kind of handprints of an 8-year-old, would we have had more like the Flintstones with record players made from pterodactyls? I don't know. I doubt it, right? But I don't think we've got a Ritalin deficiency. I don't think we're inherently broken. And I think that's part of the modern medical paradigm, is that it kind of thinks that the body is broken and needs to be fixed with pills. Like, some people just think that. And that vibe comes down from some doctors in the medical profession and some researchers. And a lot of people understandably want to completely trust every doctor they ever meet. But it's not a uniform block of people. Doctors have their own thoughts on things. Some, go beyond their allopathic training and get functional training, where they realize that these systems kind of work together, and it's complicated, and you have to remove stuff from a negative environment, try to increase a positive environment in various ways, and food has a large part to play there. And I think people who have maybe a typical doctor, and this is sort of my experience of working with clients, is that they'll talk to them about diet and lifestyle, and the doctor will say, well, there's no evidence to say that helps. And sometimes that's true, in a sense that there's no randomized controlled trials using diet on various conditions that are powered enough to be able to make statistically significant decisions on. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't work, right? It just means that there's not really much financial incentive for these kinds of trials to take place. So I think part of it is that authority of doctors that kind of echoes down into people's brains who aren't particularly interested in diving into the science, understanding the statistics of it. And I get it, I think I'm a nerd about that sort of stuff. Most people just aren't. Probably somewhere between 1 in 100 and 1 in 1,000 people will ever read a scientific paper fully, and it's a small amount, right? So most people just
that's more than I thought, actually.
Yeah, maybe it's even less. Maybe it's between sort of 1 in 1,000 and 1 in 10,000 who really want to get into it. And so you get this, like, deferring to authority. And we can't expect everyone to dive into the science in the same way. Like, I don't know how to make an iPhone, but I still want a smartphone, you know? And so I defer to authority all the time.
Mhm.
But
Mm.
I think when it comes to your own health, you have to take responsibility and
Mm.
be aware that there are these other things out there. So I think when people hear food can, you know, cause some ADHD symptoms, they're like, well, that's not what my doctor says. You know, and then we talked about this before. I think the immediate thought for a lot of people is if it's their kids they're thinking about rather than themselves, that there's a judgment on their parenting. And
Mm. Yeah.
I think we live in an environment where 90% of the Western world is metabolically unhealthy. You know, that's been documented in the scientific literature.
Yeah.
So almost everyone is unhealthy. So we live in that milieu, and it's really difficult to fight against that. You know,
Yeah.
parties where there's food available, um, the supermarket where everything's aimed at kids. And, you know, I think there's a sense of judgment, and sometimes there's even a sense of some self-judgment and self-examination where
Mm.
the kind of foods we're talking about, parents don't want to give them up either, and that they may have a sense of kind of unhealthy connection or even addiction to these types of foods, so that if there's an implication that removing them from their or their child's diet would help, then that is untenable to them and they just don't want to even consider it. So there's a backlash. Also, I think people start to identify with their condition. If they've lived with it for a long time, especially if they've gone through hard times, then the idea that someone can come along like a snake oil salesman and say that something so seemingly simple will help is met with hostility by the community. And of course, this
Mhm.
happens all the time with, um, you know, interventions which don't do as much as you would want. Certain supplements where people say you just need this one magic pill. And I get that, but this does really work for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So I think those are probably the main reasons I can think why there was such a backlash.
Yeah.
But it's good to have this controversy because it brings light on it, I think.
Yes, and we need that. I think I've said this to you before. I've just given a talk for Low Carb Down Under on this topic of ADHD and food and nutrition and what it can do. So really loved geeking out over that research. But when I put these YouTube podcast videos out regularly and talk about different subjects, some of them, you know, more controversial than others. So carnivore, for example, eating just only meat or other different topics. And the only one that's got any pushback is when I've interviewed dietitians around ADHD and autism to say that foods could improve. And that's the only time that I've, you know, on different groups it's been posted in and on the YouTube videos that's been, you know, more pushback on that than anything else. So I find people are treading on eggshells, don't want to mention this. Joe Wicks came back on that and apologized for having the audacity to say that food might play a role and try to backtrack back and step out of that. But yeah, I think it's really important that we talk about it. You also mentioned how we treat ADHD currently, and we treat with behavioral support, with therapy, and mostly with medications. And from my understanding, a lot of people get relief from that, and then they have to manage those medications because they become a little bit immune to the doses that increases, etc. But that also come with short-term side effects. And then we talk less and less about the long-term potential side effects. But yeah, they come with side effects. But importantly, I feel you touched on this, or yes, you made reference. We're not treating the root cause, and so you know those interactions with our environment, with our foods. Are there better therapies? And that's really what I'd like to get into you with, because this is an important topic to me. I feel this is because of the potential, but this is very close to your heart. So tell me, you mentioned earlier very briefly your own experiences. What was it like being diagnosed as an adult? What were the symptoms that you experienced? Because everybody experiences different symptoms, and how did diet really affect you?
Yeah, I had mental health difficulties since I was a kid. Chronic anxiety, seasonal depression, which would come on around this time of year actually. And so we're in 1st of October today, and it was really difficult. The ADHD symptoms about poor control of my attention and kind of disruptive behavior and not achieving my potential at school, always kind of getting into trouble and having to be moved away from people that I would get into trouble, sent out the classroom, all of that sort of stuff. And that's one of the ways that they diagnose as an adult. They have to look at your school report cards because they believe that it's genetic and it starts in childhood. So you do struggle to get a diagnosis if you can't show that you were marked like that at school. So that just repeatedly came up for me. I mean, I didn't find school tremendously difficult academically. I didn't try as hard as I could have at all. I rarely did homework and didn't like that side of it at all. And I don't think that is pathological. But I cruised basically, and then all of the other sort of disruptive behavior and inability to control my attention. I think as I got older, it manifested in kind of struggling to really perform as well as I wanted at work. And I would self-medicate with coffee and tea. And I was, sometimes drinking 5, 6, 7, 8 strong coffees a day. But obviously that kind of goes in a boom and bust cycle, like I found in the end with Ritalin, that it might sharpen your attention for 45 minutes or something, but then there's a kind of backlash, and you need to take more and more to get the same effect, and you burn out various receptors in the body, and you just have to quit for a while and feel kind of bored and boring, and then I would inevitably go back to it. These days I try to control how much caffeine I have. Maybe it's a few cups of tea a day and that's it. I never have coffee. So I still had these symptoms where I couldn't control my attention. I had terrible brain fog. So it felt like I didn't have access to the thinking part of my brain, like my mind's eye. It wasn't there properly. It was kind of cloudy. That's how I like to describe it. I also had, emotional dysregulation. And this is where the definitions of different psychiatric disorders start to get muddy, because there was certain sort of autism spectrum disorder symptoms, like 1 or 2, that I was thinking, could that apply to me around emotional regulation? Certainly some of these ADHD symptoms around focus and attention, and like I said, seasonal depression and anxiety. And that's one of the reasons that we want to study ADHD with depression, is to try to tease out where the similarities lie, and whether these single definitions that are from a list of symptoms are really super appropriate. But I got to the stage where I was, I got a physics degree. I started working in the laser industry, and I was wanting something different. I didn't quite know what. I started a PhD in physics, and it wasn't going well. I just wasn't able to focus on my work. I didn't feel motivated, and I sought a diagnosis to make sense of that. And eventually in 2015, a couple of years after I'd started the PhD, I got the diagnosis, which helped to make sense of my inability to focus properly on the work. As I say, the Ritalin helped to some extent, but I got the same problem that I did with caffeine, that I just had to take more and more to get the same effect. The side effects took over, and they didn't address the root cause. I genuinely believe we don't have a Ritalin deficiency as a species. And yeah, and that's what led me to changing my diet. Is I couldn't control my weight when I wasn't on stimulants, and I was sick of that. And like a lot of people, I turned up for the weight loss and stayed for the mental health benefits.
It's a great
So
quote. Yeah.
yeah, I think it might have been Amber O'Hearn who I heard say it first, but you hear it a lot. It's great. So
Hmm.
um yeah, and that sense of inattention and inability to control my attention particularly went away. Now I can be much more directed about how I'm focused and where I'm focused. Now, I think this is where I think the evolutionary adaptation comes in. I still like having multiple projects on the go. The ADHD
Mm.
thing of having lots of tabs open, that's still there. I still feel like I think creatively, which can be associated with ADHD. So I think the good things have remained and the bad things have quietened way down.
I'm glad you mentioned that because that, talking to different people that I work with, they identify as having an ADHD type brain and they like parts of that. They really do feel the positives, the benefits of that, almost a free thinker and being able to multitask and get things done and think about a problem in a totally different way. So they're the things that people kind of speak to me on, and they don't want that taken away. So the fact that you felt that the symptoms that you were struggling with and that were getting in your way and kind of tripping over your work, and I think I've heard you say that, causing issues around relationships also. But they went away, but the positives that you identify and that you enjoy, they remained. And has that been a stable since you began a ketogenic diet, or is that have they come and gone, or how has that been? And with the depression that you mentioned and anxiety.
Yeah, certainly the depression, I was really worried about that because I started a ketogenic diet in 2016 in March, and I felt great during the summer. My mood was high and even.
Mm.
The anxiety quietened way down. And round about this time, sort of end of September, beginning of October, I started to worry, okay, here comes the slow freight train of seasonal depression. And it just didn't appear. And it
Amazing.
hasn't come back. I can make myself feel low if I drink a lot, especially in the winter. Even sometimes just a few drinks of a certain type, which is funny. I think there's a lot of gut mediated things going on here, and alcohol's effect on the brain is pretty clearly bad for a lot of people. But um, yeah, besides alcohol, um, I haven't had seasonal depression come back. And with
Mm.
alcohol, it's just like a sort of normal hangover that a lot of people, when they're older than 25, start to experience, where they don't feel right mentally for a couple of days. And it doesn't
Okay.
always happen. I'm much more resilient, even if I do drink,
Mm.
which is now only probably a few times a year, for big
Mm.
occasions. And um, I usually just manage that with 5-HTP and uh, exogenous ketones, which really
Mhm.
help. It's like the open secret in the exogenous ketone industry is that it's an amazing hangover cover upper.
Oh,
Um,
now you tell me.
so yeah, and it's similar with anxiety. I can make anxiety come back if I eat the wrong things. So if I kind of press the F it button and I have some sugar, which might happen a couple of times a year or something,
Mhm.
then it can bring anxiety back. It's not nearly as bad. And again, I think
Mm.
maybe gut mediated things going on there.
Mm.
And certainly with the ADHD symptoms, I think there are certain even ketogenic foods which can induce some of the problems again. So I think if I have too much dark chocolate, um, yes, there's a bit of sugar in there. There's certain types of
Mhm.
fiber that might be an issue. Lots of caffeine and theobromine and stimulants like that. That's an interesting one. But it's not nearly as bad as it used to be, and it goes away quite quickly. So
Mm.
I think overall it's been like a, you know, depending on the day you catch me on, a sort of 85 to 100% improvement in the ADHD symptoms. And then I can make them come back a little bit if I eat or drink the wrong things, or if my environment's not very good, I'm particularly stressed out, I'm not getting the right light. I feel like light is
Yeah.
very important in all of this.
Mhm.
And I know that a
Absolutely.
lot of
Yeah.
functional medics, they say to people, you know, if you can, then move to somewhere sunnier, because it just makes such a difference to people's lives. So
Mhm.
that's certainly
Yeah.
true for me. I get as much UV as I safely can without burning. And um, it's been really good. So the ADHD symptoms, just including those emotional ones that you mentioned, you know, like it was affecting relationships, just have quietened right down to almost nothing.
Amazing. Yes. And what you're saying there as well about the foods that might push you out, it's unique, it's personal to you. So that awareness comes and taking note about and self-experimenting. You've done a lot of self-experimenting with food, which is really fascinating. That's on your YouTube channel. Which foods work for you personally and don't. And that's what people have to get to. But ketosis is a specific uh yeah, a specific therapy for the brain and for that brain energy. I'm interested to know why you feel ketogenic diet, ketosis, ketones work, how they might be benefiting somebody with ADHD. And I know that this is not known at the moment. There's so many different trials going on around the world with ketogenic diet and depression, bipolar, schizophrenia, and we're going to talk about your exciting one with ADHD. But what are your thoughts in terms of my thoughts? I think there's a lot of different interesting pathways, including brain inflammation, gut microbiome, fascinating topic, and that one and the interplay. But the low-hanging fruit really is ketones as an alternative dual fuel source. So those energy, those cells, those brain cells in the well, yeah, the cells in the brain that are trying to help us to focus on a task. We need, much more energy when we're sitting an exam or doing a test or an interview, or we're concentrating on a task than before. But somebody with insulin impairment might not be able to get the glucose and utilize brain energy. So they could be starving of energy. And the randomized controlled trials that I've read show that children, I've only seen this with children, um, uh, they are dysfunctional in their use of insulin and blood glucose from an early age, before any metabolic physical diabetes or obesity or those common co-occurring conditions with ADHD. They come out much later. But there's some really good evidence showing there's an impairment from a young age. So yeah, just your thoughts on all of that, although it's quite complicated.
Yeah, well, I would agree with you on the sort of main candidates, and it's still an open question about why ketogenic diets even really help uh, epilepsy, for which there's 100 years of evidence. And it seems to be that there needs to be a presence of ketones in the blood, but that it's not a linear relationship after that as to the efficacy of ketones. You don't just raise them and get fewer seizures. It doesn't work linearly like that. So what else is going on? Plus, with similarly with epilepsy and with psychiatric conditions, it seems that there's maybe a third of people who try it for whom it's like a magic bullet and it's amazing. They just
Mm.
feel like different people, and it's like an off-the-shelf keto diet. They're producing enough ketones for them, and they feel amazing. And great, that's amazing in itself. But then what about the other sort of half to two-thirds where maybe it's working a little bit, but not as much as they'd want, or it's not really doing what they want? That is why it's so important for us to understand why it does help the people it helps, because then we can target, tweaks to ketogenic diets, or, different approaches for the people who it doesn't just help straight away.
Mhm.
So I think you're right that the presence of ketones is, the brain loves that. You know, if you through an evolutionary lens, if our ancestors got duller and duller mentally as they were hunting over the course of a day or two or three, then they wouldn't have survived. And maybe there were people like that who didn't survive, but the ones who got sharper and sharper, then they had a better chance of surviving. So with evolutionary pressure being what it is over many thousands of generations, it seems likely that the ones who adapted to starvation conditions whilst hunting to become sharper mentally would be more likely to survive. And so that seems to be what happens when, you know, I've got a big meeting or something. I'll maybe fast for 24 hours and have some exogenous ketones, and I just feel super sharp. So I think the presence of ketones, the brain loves that first and foremost. Then gut-mediated effects, and that's super complicated. I think it's still, to some extent, the Wild West. The testing and application of therapies to the gut is not precise. I think there's functional doctors and practitioners who do it quite well, but I think it's not targeted enough yet. And I think a ketogenic diet, and for some people a carnivore diet, can be great because it starves pathogenic microbes that might be there in a way that's just sort of blanket, like you're just not feeding those ones anymore. And some people who come off the keto or carnivore diet who feel great on them, then they feel terrible when they come off. I think there may be pathological microbes in the gut which don't really go away. So I think that's, for me, probably the biggest likely candidate for why it helps a lot of people is it starves pathogenic microbes that shouldn't be there, because we've, you know, so many of us got messed up guts in this modern world where we had a dozen rounds of antibiotics when we were kids. Maybe we were born C-section or bottle fed, and I understand that's a very complex issue, and I completely understand why that happens. But it does impact the gut, and you know, with the antibiotics, with the modern food environment, with toxins and pollutants in the environment, what chance do our guts have of developing normally and healthily? So I think those are my two biggest candidates, and that things like inflammation and oxidative stress very often come off the back of poor gut health, and that's really kind of where it all begins.
Yes. So it brings me to the study that you have mentioned, and it's coming up next year with Oxford University. So can you tell us about that, and what are you going to study these mechanisms? But how is it going to work? Just yeah, let us know all about that.
Yeah, so the plan is to recruit people who have
Sorry.
ADHD symptoms up to the threshold of diagnosis level, and we're recruiting people who don't already have a diagnosis and are on drugs, because we would be concerned that if they were already on drugs, then they might taper off the drugs if they enjoy the ketogenic diet, and their ADHD scores wouldn't change, but actually it's the ketogenic diet starting to do the heavy lifting as the drugs taper down. So we're recruiting from that population. They need to have a minimum depression score as well, and so we're looking to get 100 people in adults in the UK with those selection criteria, and then we'll split them into two groups of 50, and in the intervention group we'll coach them on using a ketogenic diet for their mental health, give them the support they need, and measure ADHD symptoms and depression symptoms over 16 weeks. We'll also measure various metabolic markers in the blood. We hope to measure continuous glucose and maybe continuous ketones, and certainly daily ketone measurement. And we'll hope to measure various other markers, including mitochondrial function, because we think that will be a really interesting marker of who this helps and why, and maybe crucially who it doesn't help and why. And then in the comparison group, and I'm calling them the comparison group because Jeff Volek talks about there being no real control because they know that they're not eating some ketogenic diet. And I'm not sure I always totally agree on that, but anyway, call it the comparison group for now. They'll be coached by a dietitian in a time-matched way, so they're getting the same amount of exposure to a coach and the same level of support to the kind of Eat Well guide, which in the UK is, you know, the sort of based on the dietary guidelines. It's healthy whole grains and low saturated fat and that kind of thing. And we're also going to introduce a kind of sham diet element where we talk about a particular set of nutrients doing something positive for the person, and it's, you know, it'll hopefully not do anything, but it'll give them the belief that the diet will do something. So that similarly, if people know they're on a ketogenic diet, they'll feel, oh, I've heard about this, this works. We want the people in the control arm to feel like that too, so that it's really a true comparison of keto with coaching versus Eat Well guide plus this diet
Interesting.
and coaching. So we'll run it for 16 weeks, do the same measurements on everyone, and see how effective it is.
Are you expecting a dropout rate? Have you got a contingency for that? Because we do have a high dropout rate of some studies, nutritional studies.
Yeah, I mean, looking at Ian Campbell's study in Edinburgh, which was small, but they had a 91% adherence rate. And I think the level of support makes a big difference here, because there are other studies where there's, like, say, minimal or almost no support, and it reverses, and there's maybe like a 90% dropout rate.
Yes, I've seen
I think
that.
with that level of support, where people genuinely feel, you know, supported in their journey, I think, especially if you can get past the first few weeks where the usual sort of bumps are, and people start to really feel the benefit, then what happened with Ian's study is they wanted to do a washout period where they changed the diet back to their normal diet to do some tests, and most people said, definitely not, I'm not changing from a ketogenic diet. So the actual
How
what happened
wonderful.
there was they couldn't get people to drop out. So I hope it's like that, although people with ADHD and depression, it might be hard, but I think with the proper support, we're showing that that's not what happens. So that's why I want to give them coaching support, to make sure they feel like they can reach out, like they've got that support there.
Wonderful. And yes, that's what I've heard too. Those studies where they've had a very disappointing dropout rate, they have indicated that they didn't support and they didn't prep those people to make sure they knew what they were getting into. So that was a really missing piece, but a crucial part that you're including. And with Oxford University, so throwing some real academic weight behind this topic that sometimes gets put in pigeonholed as fad or just kind of weird or out there. So really credentialed. So this is going to be really exciting, and people can build then on that. So if somebody wanted to be involved, what, you know, is it a case of you're going to recruit and they can't apply? So how would they, if they wanted to be involved, could they get in touch somehow?
Yeah, so we do want to recruit blinded, because if we assign someone who's dead keen on doing the ketogenic arm the Eat Well guide arm, then that's not really going to work as a proper test. And so we're going to recruit from clinics and say it's a diet and lifestyle test, and they won't know what the other arm is doing. So I think you know, it's impossible to blind everyone. If they sort of look me up or something, then they might hear me talking about it or whatever. But you know, you do your best. So the people can't apply directly, but what they can do is work with us at MetPsy, which is my company that's working on this. So we're doing commercial pilots at the moment on using continuous glucose monitor and, you know, HR, heart rate variability measurements, using things like Oura Ring, which I'm wearing, and tracking that while we track people's mood, energy, and cognition. And we're starting with these kinds of symptoms like brain fog, irritability, lack of focus. And we're currently conducting our first pilot on that, and we've got data coming in. It's super interesting. And people can, come on to MetPsy.com and, register their interest or join the mailing list, and we'll be keeping everyone up to date about what we're doing on that. And so that's like a sort of commercial way of getting involved. And then the Oxford study is like a sort of formal academic way of testing that. So people can absolutely get involved if they want. And, the people who are involved in the academic study, they'll be selected without their knowledge, as it were, of what all the plans are.
Yeah, and exciting, I think, particularly as all of those studies are coming out on ketogenic diet for different types of mental ill health, but not for neurodivergence, but this will be a first for ADHD. So great, really great stuff, and a large trial as well. So I'm really fascinated. I've already said that to you, so I can't wait to follow and hear more. We're going to wrap up shortly. I'm just wondering if there's anything else you would like to cover or anything you'd like to let people know that we haven't mentioned yet.
I don't think so. No, it was really great chatting. And as I say, people can go to metpsy.com, metpsy.com, and check out what we're doing, get involved. And I've got an interview with Brett Scher, which is on YouTube. He's got the great Metabolic Mind channel talking about all of this. So if you want to know more about the study or my background, then I go into there too. But it's been really great chatting, and I appreciate all the work you do. So thanks again.
Yeah, well, I'll stay in touch, and I'll definitely keep geeking out by all your awesome work out there. Thanks for spending time with me today, Ali.
Thanks, Claire.
Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please make sure to subscribe. This really helps us to be able to create more content.